The porcelain didn't just break, it disintegrated. My mother-in-law, Teresa, stood over the wreckage, her face a mask of practiced outrage. She had yanked the cord of my air compressor as if she were unplugging a redundant appliance, halting a $45,000 restoration project. To her, I was just a woman playing with old trash while her son provided. She hadn't realized my silence wasn't submission. It was an audit in progress. If you were in my place, would you have ignited a confrontation then, or stayed silent to prepare your counter? I didn't shout. Shouting is the refuge of those who lack leverage. I stayed on my knees, my fingers grazing the cold marble as I gathered the white shards of the 19th century porcelain vase. It was a delicate piece, or it had been before Teresa decided my studio was her personal theater for grievances. I reached for my phone, but not to call my husband or seek comfort. I opened the camera app. Click. The jagged edges of the broken neck. Click. The severed power cord of the compressor. I was documenting a liability, not a tragedy. Teresa watched me, her breath hitching in that rhythmic way she used when she wanted to signal she was the one under duress. She thought I was cleaning up her mess. In reality, I was preserving the scene of a breach. I didn't just save these photos for Connor, I forwarded them to my insurance adjuster immediately. In the States, when a $45,000 asset is compromised, my liability insurance handles the recovery through a process called subrogation. The insurance company would be the one to sue Teresa to recover the loss, and I was more than happy to provide the paper trail. Connor entered the room then. He carried the scent of expensive sandalwood cologne and the distinct, sharp edge of a man who had spent his day trying to sell properties that weren't moving. He didn't look at the floor. He didn't look at my hands. He looked at his mother's face. "Madison, for heaven's sake, what have you done now?" he asked, his voice strained. "She was attacking me with that machine, Connor," Teresa whimpered, clutching her chest as if her heart were actually capable of breaking for someone other than herself. The noise, it's too much for my nerves. I told her she needs to focus on the house, on you. Connor sighed, a sound that had become the soundtrack to my last 3 years. He walked over to me, stepping over a large piece of the porcelain. "Maddie, just be reasonable. She's 72. If the noise bothers her, just stop for the day. Apologize so we can have a quiet dinner. Is that too much to ask?" I looked up at him, and for a second, I didn't see my husband. I saw a middleman negotiating a bad deal. In hindsight, I realized that a crack in an old painting often starts from beneath the paint, where the naked eye never sees it until it's too late. The surface looks fine, but the structural integrity is already gone. I was seeing the underpainting of my marriage, and the colors were ugly. "I'm not apologizing for working, Connor," I said, my voice as flat and dry as old parchment. He stiffened, reaching down to grab his briefcase, which had tipped over near the door. As he hoisted it up, a manila folder slid across the wood floor. It had the blue and gold embossed logo of a boutique investment bank, the kind that specializes in high-interest bridge loans and aggressive debt collection. Connor's face went a shade of pale I'd never seen before. He lunged for it, shoving it back into his bag with a frantic, uncoordinated motion that screamed of a secret being exposed. "We'll talk about this later," he muttered, ushering his mother out of the studio without meeting my eyes. I stood up, the last piece of the vase heavy in my palm. Why was an ambitious real estate developer carrying documents from a bank that only deals with high-stakes financial salvage? The silence of the manor felt like an unpaid invoice. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that had been accumulating interest for 3 years. Looking back now, I realized my first mistake wasn't staying, it was paying. When we first married, this house, a sprawling piece of Charleston history, was on the verge of being seized for back taxes and a neglected mortgage. Connor's real estate business had hit a plateau that looked more like a cliff. He had the charm to sell a house, but he didn't have the discipline to keep his own. I had stepped in. I took the $450,000 I'd earned from restoring a set of 17th century frescoes for a private estate and used it as a structural repair for our finances. I didn't think of it as a gift. I thought of it as an investment in our future. Truth be told, I believed that by saving his family's legacy, I was buying a seat at the table. I didn't realize I was just funding a theater where I would be the only audience member for their insults. Then came Teresa. She moved in temporarily to save on her own mounting expenses while she transitioned into a new apartment. That transition had lasted 1,095 days. Her presence was a subscription I never signed up for, yet I was the only one footing the bill. She didn't contribute a single cent to the upkeep, yet she patrolled the hallways like a warden, inspecting my work and narrating my perceived failures to anyone who would listen. I'd been the silent investor in their version of family, while they treated me like an intrusive guest in a house my labor had secured. Later that evening, after the broken porcelain had been swept away and the house had settled into a tense, artificial quiet, I found myself in the kitchen. I was reaching for the recycling bin when I saw a crumpled envelope that had missed its mark. It was from the same boutique investment bank Connor had been so desperate to hide. I smoothed the paper out on the marble counter. It wasn't a marketing brochure, it was a formal notice of default. The loan amount was $2 million. But it was the name on the account that stopped my breath. It wasn't Connor's firm. It was my restoration company. It took me years to understand that trust is a luxury people like Connor overdraft until the account is empty. He hadn't just been hiding a secret. He had been using my professional identity as collateral for a life he couldn't afford. The manila folder wasn't a broker's deal. It was a ledger of my own impending ruin, signed with a hand that wasn't mine. Teresa wasn't just a guest. She was a blockade. She began intercepting my business calls, telling gallery owners and private collectors that I was taking a sabbatical to focus on my domestic duties. I overheard her one Tuesday afternoon, her voice sugar-coated with that false Charleston charm, explaining to my most consistent client that I was simply too overwhelmed to handle another restoration. It was a calculated attempt to isolate me from my own income. This is how predators work. They don't just take what you have, they cut off your ability to make more. At the time, I didn't realize how deliberate the coordination was between mother and son. That evening, Connor presented me with a document titled General Power of Attorney for Business Management. He claimed the bank needed my formal authorization to restructure his current projects, a desperate attempt to retroactively legalize the $2 million forgery before the bank's internal audit could flag inconsistent signatures. I looked at the paper. It wasn't a gesture of support. It was a hostile takeover attempt wrapped in a husband's concern. Looking back now, I realize my endurance was often mistaken for fragility. But there is a specific kind of strength found in the survival of a long-term ambush. It is a tactical silence, the ability to stay still while the predator thinks you are already caught. This is the invisible chain of a survivor. I was becoming a ghost in my own studio, but it was the only way to move without tripping the alarms. Every snide comment from Teresa and every pressured request from Connor became data points in a larger audit. I wasn't being managed. I was gathering intelligence. I didn't sign his document. I told him I needed my personal attorney to review it, a delay that cost me a week of escalating tension in the house. During those 7 days, I met secretly with a forensic accountant and a specialist in heritage law. We sat in a windowless office downtown, away from the prying eyes of the Charleston social circle. The accountant didn't see art or legacy. He saw numbers that didn't add up specifically. A series of withdrawals totaling $600,000 from my business reserve account over the last 18 months. The chain was no longer invisible. Connor had been treating my professional license like a skeleton key to every door I'd worked 20 years to lock. I realized then that he hadn't just built a lie, he had built a cage. And he had used my own tools to forge the bars. But as I looked at the final page of the accountant's preliminary report, I saw the true extent of the damage. Connor hadn't just taken the money. He had mapped a way to make me legally responsible for the $2 million debt he had accrued in my name. The signature on the loan application was a masterpiece of forgery. My husband had spent years watching me steady my hand to repair delicate canvas, yet he used that same observation to replicate the loop of my M on a document that effectively sold my future. $2 million. The boutique bank hadn't questioned it because Connor had presented himself as the managing partner of our joint life, a title I had never officially granted, but one he had assumed by proxy through my silence. "It's a clean imitation, Arthur," the forensic accountant said as he adjusted his spectacles. But the pressure on the downstrokes is too heavy. This wasn't written by an artist. It was written by a man in a hurry to save himself. I stared at the document. This wasn't just a financial breach. It was a total loss of structural integrity. I had used $450,000 of my own hard-earned capital to anchor this manor, believing I was preserving a home. I didn't realize I was merely furnishing a vault for Connor's mounting debts. He had leveraged the very walls I had saved to fund a lifestyle of sandalwood and hollow charm. In the world of professional restoration, the most egregious mistake isn't the presence of a crack. It is the attempt to mask that flaw behind a layer of false color. Once you paint over the truth, the original work is lost forever. I realized then that my marriage had been a series of overpaintings, layer after layer of just ignore her and be reasonable until the woman I was supposed to be was buried under Connor's convenience. I didn't return to the house to scream. I returned to my studio and sat among my pigments and solvents. I opened a new file on my tablet, not a restoration plan, but a divestment strategy. My lawyer had been clear. Since the manor was purchased using separate funds from my grandmother's inheritance and my early business profits assets, I'd strictly kept in a separate account to prevent any legal commingling, and Connor had signed a quitclaim deed years ago in exchange for me clearing his credit card. Debts? The property remained my sole asset. Connor's forgery wasn't just a crime. It was a terminal error in his accounting. By the time I heard his car pull into the gravel driveway at 6:30 p.m., my heritage lawyer had already filed the emergency petition. I was no longer a wife waiting for an apology. I was a majority shareholder preparing to liquidate a toxic asset. If I'm being honest, the most chilling part wasn't the theft. It was the realization that Connor actually believed I was too manageable to ever look at the books. He had bet $2 million on my perceived weakness. He was about to find out that a woman who can restore a shattered 19th century vase piece by piece has the patience to dismantle a lie just as methodically. Madison, are you still in that dusty room? Teresa's voice drifted down the hall, sharp and demanding. Connor wants to know why dinner isn't started. We have guests coming on Friday. I didn't answer. I just began the process of changing every digital password associated with my professional license. The manageable wife was gone. The auditor had arrived. The evening of the party arrived with a chilling precision. Outside, the gas lanterns of Charleston flickered against the humid night air, and the scent of jasmine mingled with the exhaust of luxury sedans pulling up to the manor. Inside, Teresa was in her element, presiding over a catered spread that cost more than most people's monthly rent money that, of course, had been withdrawn from my operating account just 48 hours earlier. She wore a string of pearls that I had purchased for her 2 birthdays ago, back when I still believed that kindness could purchase a mother's respect. Looking back now, I see the profound irony of it all. Teresa and Connor were suffering from the illusion of power that comes from a hollow wallet. They were socialites on lease, playing a role in a production they couldn't afford to fund. Their status was a luxury item they had rented using my credit, yet they had convinced themselves that the name on the front door mattered more than the signature on the bank transfers. In reality, their authority was a facade, one that only stood as long as I continued to pay the maintenance fees. When the money is gone, people like them don't just lose their influence, they lose their identity, because they have no internal value to fall back on. As the guests finished their first course, I didn't join them for the toast. Instead, I stood in my studio, surrounded by the scent of linseed oil and the harsh glow of my work lamps. Beside me sat Arthur and my heritage lawyer, their presence a stark contrast to the hollow laughter echoing from the dining room. "Connor, Teresa," I called out, my voice cutting through the chatter as they passed the studio door. "A moment of your time. It's a matter of business." Connor walked in first, a glass of expensive bourbon in his hand and a smirk of annoyance on his face. "Madison, not now. We have guests." "The guests are the reason we're doing this now," I said, sliding the audit report across my work table. "I've completed the restoration project, not on a vase, but on our finances." Connor's smirk died as his eyes landed on the handwriting analysis. Beside it lay the default notice for the $2 million loan, the one he had secured by forging my name. The silence that followed was heavy, clinical, and final. Teresa entered behind him, her face twisting into a mask of indignation. But as she saw the sheer volume of documented evidence, the color began to drain from her cheeks. I didn't smirk. I didn't raise voice. I simply let the weight of the numbers do the talking. "I've spent 3 years being a silent investor in your version of family," I said. "The audit is finished, and the results are terminal." Madison, let's be reasonable, Connor started, his voice cracking. Reason is a currency you've already spent, Connor, I replied. I handed him the ultimatum my lawyer had drafted. You have exactly 60 seconds to decide if this conversation stays in this room, or if I walk out there and share these documents with the men you're trying to impress. And remember, Connor bank fraud almost always triggers a tax evasion audit. I've already flagged the income inconsistencies to the IRS. They have a very specific interest in $2 million disappearing acts, and unlike me, they don't offer 60-second ultimatums. The look in his eyes wasn't love. It was the realization that he was no longer the one managing the account. The pen felt heavier than the truth. Connor's face didn't just fall, it eroded as he looked at the signature on the $2 million loan application, a perfect, fraudulent imitation of my own. He finally understood the gravity of his accounting error. I wasn't just his wife anymore. I was the primary creditor in a bankruptcy he hadn't seen coming. Arthur, my accountant, adjusted his spectacles, his expression as sterile as a surgical theater. We have the forensic analysis of the handwriting. He noted, his voice a flat drone. Combined with the unauthorized withdrawals from the operating account, we're looking at several counts of financial fraud. Connor tried to reach for my hand, but I didn't move. I simply gestured toward the legal documents spread across the work table. Looking back now, I realize you mistook my focus for blindness, I said, my voice clinical and quiet. You thought that because I was busy restoring the past, I wasn't paying attention to how you were sabotaging our future. If I'm being honest, I think you actually believed your own lie. I didn't want a long, drawn-out legal battle that would bleed my company dry. I wanted a clean restoration. I offered him a buyout, a surgical separation. He would sign over his 15% stake in the firm and his claim to the heritage estate. In exchange, the buyout capital would be paid directly to the boutique bank to satisfy the $2 million debt. He would walk away with his freedom, but he would leave with exactly what he carried into this marriage: nothing. And my mother, he whispered, his charm finally fully depleted. I looked at Teresa. She was clutching her pearls so hard I thought the string might snap. She had lived in my house for 1,095 days, narrating my failures while I paid for her luxury. She had no legal standing, no equity, and now no leverage. The manor is in my name, purchased with the initial profits of my restoration business, I said. You have 30 days to find an apartment that fits your actual budget. Teresa, not the one you've been renting from my operating account. The signing took less than 20 minutes. The scratching of the pen on the legal bond paper was the only sound in the room, a staccato rhythm that signaled the end of a 3-year overdraft. When the last page was notarized, my lawyer collected the folders. There was no shouting. There were only the sounds of guests laughing in the next room, oblivious to the fact that the host had just been evicted from their own facade. I watched Connor lead his mother toward the stairs. He didn't look back. Teresa lived for the prestige of the Charleston Historical Preservation Society. I made sure to send a polite email to the board members, explaining exactly why I would no longer be hosting the annual gala. In this city, social currency is the only thing that matters, and by tomorrow morning, hers would be bankrupt. I had finally stopped being manageable, and in doing so, I had become the only person in the room who actually owned the space they stood in. The studio was finally still. The silence didn't feel lonely. It felt like a finished piece of work. It wasn't the heavy, anxious, quiet I had lived in for 3 years. It was the clean, empty space of a fresh canvas. I sat at my work table, my fingers tracing the grain of the wood, and realized that for the first time in 1,095 days, I didn't have to listen for the sound of a critique, an insult, or a demand. Looking back now, I see that I had been a world-class restorer of objects, but a reckless destroyer of my own boundaries. I had invested $450,000 of my own hard-earned capital into a house that I treated as a home, while the people inside treated it as a vault. I had believed that if I were useful enough, I would eventually be respected. But utility is not a bridge to respect. It is a lure for exploitation. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing every bill while they overdrafted my compassion until the account was terminal. Connor carried his last suitcase out of the door 7 days ago. He didn't look at me, and I didn't look for an apology. If I'm being honest, an apology would have been just another layer of false color over a ruined landscape. He didn't marry a partner. He married a woman he thought he could manage. He sold me his remaining shares at a significant loss because staying tied to the company meant answering to me, and for a man like Connor, the cost of accountability was higher than the value of the assets. Teresa left shortly after, moving into a modest apartment that fits the actual reality of her bank account. She left without a final lecture, because even a narcissist like her knows that you cannot narrate a story to someone who has already closed the book. I have since established the Restoration Trust. Its purpose isn't just to save historical artifacts, but to provide legal and financial protection for independent creators, the women who are so focused on the beauty they are building that they don't see the theft happening in the margins of their own lives. It is my way of ensuring that the invisible chains I once wore are broken for others before they are even forged. To those of you who feel like you are standing on the edge of your own life, listening to people who share your name but don't value your spirit, this is for you. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from making yourself smaller to accommodate people who have done nothing to earn the space they take up. You are told that your endurance is a virtue, and that to set a boundary is to be too dramatic or unreasonable. But I've learned that some forms of exploitation stay invisible until you stop cooperating. You are not a worthless burden or a stagehand in someone else's production. You are the one holding the brush. The people who try to dim your light do so because they are terrified of what you will see when you finally turn it on them. You do not need their permission to exist fully, and you certainly do not need their validation to be luminous. Revenge, I have discovered, isn't about destruction. It isn't about the viral explosion or the public humiliation. True revenge is accounting the moment you stop subsidizing people who do not respect you. It is the act of reclaiming your worth and building a life so brilliant, so true, and so peaceful that they no longer have the credentials to enter the room. I stood in my studio as the afternoon sun hit the floor, much like it did the day the porcelain shattered. But the work I am doing now isn't for a client, it is for myself. I am taking my time with this restoration. I am making sure the structural integrity is perfect. And for the first time in my life, the only voice in the room is mine. Have you ever had to make a painful decision to protect your own worth? I'd really like to hear your perspective.